The autumn sunlight slanted across the polished oak floor, catching the faint sheen of varnish and casting long, deliberate shadows that seemed to stretch toward Clara Whitmore. She adjusted the folds of her burgundy shawl, its fabric warm against her shoulders, and looked up to see Samuel Greystone entering. His gray beard caught the golden light, making his expression appear older, yet somehow more resolute. Moments later, Evelyn Hart stepped softly across the threshold, the indigo silk of her kimono whispering against itself with each movement. They exchanged courteous greetings, yet an unspoken tension lingered between them, subtle but undeniable. Clara felt it in the way Samuel's eyes lingered briefly on her, as though searching for something hidden. Evelyn's gaze swept the room with quiet precision, taking in every detail, yet revealing little of her own thoughts. The air held a stillness that was not quite peaceful, more a pause before something yet to be acknowledged. As Clara gestured toward the chairs, she wondered if this gathering would follow familiar rhythms, or if something different, perhaps unsettling, waited beneath the surface of their shared work. Clara's voice carried an even, measured warmth as she invited Samuel Greystone and Evelyn Hart to sit, her tone carefully modulated to convey welcome. Yet a faint tremor edged her words, a subtle vibration betraying the presence of a shadow within herself, one she had not yet named. Samuel settled into his chair, the movement deliberate, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though reading a message that had not been spoken aloud. He did not interrupt, but his quiet attention made Clara acutely aware of her own guardedness. Evelyn, meanwhile, sat with her hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze turned toward the clock on the wall. The slow movement of its hands seemed to absorb her completely, as if she were measuring time, not in minutes, but in truths waiting to be revealed. The room's quiet was thickened by these silent observations, and Clara felt both seen and concealed at once, uncertain which sensation would prove more dangerous in the moments ahead. Outside, wind rattled the brass sign bearing Clara Whitmore's name, the sound sharp against the muted quiet indoors. She paused mid-thought, her attention pulled toward that metallic clatter, wondering if it might be less a coincidence than a warning. The flickering notion unsettled her, though she kept her expression composed. Samuel Greystone leaned back in his chair, his voice low as he mentioned a patient's cryptic remark about mirrors and the distortions they could hide. The words seemed to hang between them, refusing to dissipate. Evelyn Hart tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes narrowing just enough to suggest she was piecing together a puzzle whose edges were still unclear. Clara felt their combined focus pressing gently against her own guarded mind, the wind outside continuing its restless tapping as if urging her to consider what reflections she might have avoided for too long. The thought followed her into the stillness, leaving a residue of unease she could not easily dismiss. As the session began, Clara asked Samuel Greystone and Evelyn Hart to share observations from the recent group therapy circle. Her voice was steady, yet her mind wandered toward a familiar craving she had kept hidden from them, a quiet, persistent habit that had become both refuge and chain. Samuel spoke first, noting how trust in the circle proved fragile, often requiring careful tending lest it unravel. His words carried the weight of experience, and Clara felt their truth settle within her. Evelyn followed, her tone thoughtful, remarking that silence could be both sanctuary and trap, depending on whether it was chosen or imposed. Clara nodded, aware that her own silence belonged to the latter category, its edges sharp and unyielding. She listened closely, allowing their insights to mingle with her private reflections, aware that each comment was brushing against the shape of something she had not yet dared to name aloud. The room's antique lamp, perched on a carved walnut table, flickered twice, as though catching its breath. Clara felt a strange kinship with its unreliable glow, the wavering light mirroring her own uncertain steadiness. She tried to focus on Samuel Greystone's words, yet her attention kept returning to the lamp's trembling shadow. Samuel's gaze lingered on her, not unkind, but searching, as though he suspected the cause of her unease without needing it spoken. Evelyn Hart sat opposite, her fingers slowly tracing the embroidered hem of her indigo kimono, each movement deliberate and contemplative. The faint rasp of fabric against her skin seemed to punctuate the silence between them. Clara wondered if they saw more than she intended to show. The flicker of the lamp casting shifting shapes on the wall that hinted at forms just beyond recognition. She drew her shawl closer, though the room was not cold, and let the moment pass without comment. Clara Whitmore leaned slightly forward, posing a question about patterns of avoidance, her voice steady until a single syllable faltered and caught. The hesitation was brief, yet she felt it ripple through the room. Samuel Greystone responded by recalling a patient's dream involving locked doors, the image vivid as he described the heavy wood and unseen spaces beyond. Clara listened, the metaphor pressing uncomfortably close to her own guarded thoughts. Evelyn Hart, her gaze unfixed, murmured that some doors are locked from within, not without. Her words hung in the air with quiet finality, drawing Clara's attention sharply toward her. The comment felt both universal and personal, as though Evelyn had reached into a place Clara preferred to keep untouched. The conversation moved forward, yet Clara sensed that this moment had left an imprint, subtle but enduring. The air thickened as though the walls themselves had drawn closer when Clara spoke about courage in facing addictions. She chose her words with care, avoiding any direct reflection of her own experience, even as it pulsed beneath the surface. Samuel Greystone's gray beard twitched with a half-smile, not mocking, but tinged with recognition, as though he sensed the spaces between her sentences. Evelyn Hart nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the trembling shadow cast by the flickering lamp. Clara felt that both were listening not only to her words but to the silences threaded through them. The conversation remained measured, yet each exchange carried the weight of something approaching disclosure. Clara's heart quickened, though her voice remained calm, the tension in the room becoming an almost tangible presence. Rain began to patter against the tall window panes, each drop marking a measured beat in Clara Whitmore's chest. The steady rhythm seemed to underscore her thoughts, lending them a quiet urgency. Samuel Greystone glanced toward the window, remarking on the weather's persistence and the way it could alter the mood of a room. His tone was casual, yet Clara detected an undercurrent of intent beneath it. Evelyn Hart, her kimono sleeves gathered neatly in her lap, observed that storms often reveal what sunny days choose to conceal. The remark stirred something in Clara, a recognition that perhaps her own calm days had hidden more than she cared to admit. The rain continued its soft percussion, blurring the view outside and wrapping the room in a cocoon of muted sound, as though inviting truths to surface. Clara introduced a new exercise to Samuel Greystone and Evelyn Hart, writing unmailed letters to one's hidden self. She explained its purpose with deliberate clarity, encouraging them to address truths they might otherwise avoid. Her own fingers lingered on the empty page before her, the crisp paper seeming both invitation and challenge. Samuel began writing swiftly, his pen scratching across the surface with a rhythm that suggested urgency. As though a secret were being unearthed, Evelyn paused before beginning, her head tilted slightly, as if listening for footsteps that might approach from some unseen corridor. Clara watched them both, aware that her own letter would demand more honesty than she was accustomed to offering. The quiet in the room was deepened by the faint sound of rain outside, each participant enclosed in their private search for words. A faint scent of sandalwood drifted from Evelyn Hart's indigo kimono, curling through the air with a calming presence that Clara found unexpectedly comforting. She could not say why it eased her mind, but the sensation lingered. Samuel Greystone looked up from his page, sharing a fragment from his letter that spoke of echoes in the hallway, a phrase that seemed to carry layers of meaning. Clara listened closely, the words stirring her own curiosity about the echoes she might have ignored within herself. Evelyn continued writing without comment, though the set of her shoulders suggested deep concentration. The atmosphere was quiet, yet charged, the exercise opening subtle pathways toward disclosure. Clara's pen hovered above her paper, uncertain whether to follow Samuel's lead or remain within safer territory. The sandalwood's warmth contrasted sharply with the chill of hesitation she felt. A clock on the wall chimed, its sound precise and unyielding, and Clara Whitmore felt her heart quicken in response. The moment was small, yet sharp, cutting through her focus. Samuel Greystone noticed her reaction but chose to remain silent, his eyes holding a question he did not voice. Evelyn Hart, her tone gentle yet probing, asked whether the letters might be read aloud to confront the silences they contained. Clara considered the suggestion, aware that speaking such words could shift the balance in the room. The chime's echo faded, leaving a quiet that seemed to demand a decision. She drew a measured breath, feeling the weight of their expectation settle upon her. Clara agreed to the reading, her voice steadier than the pulse beneath it. Samuel Greystone began, his words describing a figure who resembled Clara, yet stood entirely in shadow, watching from a distance. The image was unsettling in its familiarity. Evelyn Hart read next, her letter composed of questions without answers, each one lingering in the air like mist that refused to clear. Clara listened intently, aware that the room's atmosphere had shifted, the boundaries between speaker and listener dissolving. Her own letter lay untouched, the blank space feeling heavier with each passing moment. The act of hearing their words made her aware that silence could no longer serve as her shield without cost. The next day, Clara Whitmore arranged chairs in a wide ring for the expanded group therapy circle. She took care with the symmetry, knowing how subtle arrangements could influence conversation. Samuel Greystone entered, observing the even spacing with a thoughtful nod. Evelyn Hart arrived soon after, whispering that circles can be both protective and enclosing, depending on who steps inside them. The comment lingered with Clara as participants began to take their seats. She wondered which role the circle would play today and whether its shape might confine her more than it freed her. The quiet before the session felt poised, as though awaiting a shift in the current. Clara listened attentively to each participant's words, yet her mind kept returning to the shadowed figure Samuel had described the day before. The image seemed to follow her, hovering at the edges of her focus. Evelyn Hart caught her glance and offered a reassuring smile. Yet beneath Evelyn's calm expression lay a hint of caution, as though she too sensed the approach of something significant. The room's conversations flowed around them, but Clara felt a subtle tether connecting her thoughts to both Samuel's and Evelyn's unspoken perceptions. The atmosphere held a quiet tension, a readiness for revelation that could arrive without warning. The conversations within the circle grew more candid as the hour passed. Clara found herself speaking of certain late-night rituals she could not easily explain. Her voice steady, but her words weighted. Samuel Greystone listened without interruption, his nod grave and deliberate, conveying understanding without judgment. Evelyn Hart asked gently what purpose those rituals served, her tone both inviting and layered with mystery. Clara hesitated, sensing that any answer would draw her closer to truths she had long kept hidden. The circle felt smaller now, each face turned toward her, waiting for the thread she might choose to pull free. Clara hesitated before speaking, then admitted to finding comfort in repetition. Though she avoided naming the act itself, her words were careful, their edges rounded by caution. Samuel Greystone tapped his fingers lightly on the armrest, the rhythm steady but thoughtful, as if marking time for her to continue. Evelyn Hart's gaze drifted toward the rain-streaked window, her eyes searching the blurred scene outside for an unseen sign. The room's quiet deepened, and Clara felt the pull between concealment and confession growing stronger. Yet the moment passed without her crossing that final threshold, leaving the truth still partly veiled. That evening, Clara sat alone in her office, the burgundy shawl draped loosely around her shoulders. The silence felt different now, less companionable and more insistent. Shadows pooled in the corners, their shapes indistinct but watchful. She contemplated the words Samuel Greystone and Evelyn Hart had spoken earlier, replaying them like fragments from a half-remembered story. There was a pull within her toward something she both feared and longed to face. A presence she could no longer wholly deny. The lamp on her desk cast a narrow cone of light, leaving much of the room in shadow, as though reminding her how much remained hidden. She stayed there until the hour grew late, the quiet pressing close. The next session opened with Samuel Greystone recounting a patient's dream of walking through a forest at night. His voice carried the rhythm of a practiced storyteller, each detail deliberate. Clara noted the image's resonance, feeling its connection to her own unspoken journey. Evelyn Hart added that night journeys often lead to unexpected clearings, her words carrying both hope and warning. The conversation moved gently, yet Clara sensed that these shared images were leading her toward something she had avoided naming. The forest in Samuel's story seemed to stretch around them, unseen yet palpable in the room's quiet. Clara proposed an imagery exercise, guiding Samuel Greystone and Evelyn Hart along a mental path lined with unmarked doors. Her voice was steady, weaving the scene with care. Samuel described pausing before one door, unwilling to open it, the hesitation clear in his tone. Evelyn spoke of turning a handle slowly, feeling a chill seep from the space beyond before stepping inside. Clara listened, aware that each image carried personal weight. The exercise felt less like fiction and more like an invitation to confront guarded places. She imagined her own path, the doors waiting, and wondered which she would dare to touch. Evelyn Hart's description stirred a memory within Clara, of a door she had never dared to open. The recollection was sharp, its presence undeniable. Samuel Greystone remarked on the courage required for such acts, his tone respectful. Evelyn asked if sometimes the door is merely a mirror in disguise, reflecting what one fears to see. Clara felt her breath catch at the connection, realizing the words mirrored Samuel's earlier remark about echoes. The idea that a barrier might conceal nothing but oneself was unsettling, and it lingered in her thoughts as the exercise drew to a close. Clara's breath caught, the weight of Evelyn Hart's words settling deep. They mirrored Samuel Greystone's earlier talk of echoes, linking the two moments with quiet precision. The room seemed to shrink slightly, the air heavier, as Clara sensed her private dependency was no longer invisible to them. She felt their attention like a steady light, not harsh but impossible to ignore. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers still, as if movement might betray more than she wished. The conversation moved forward, yet Clara knew the threshold between secrecy and disclosure had been approached. Samuel Greystone spoke plainly, his voice calm but firm, asking if Clara Whitmore had considered seeking help herself. The question was unadorned, yet it carried weight. Evelyn Hart remained silent, her presence supportive, her eyes steady on Clara. The moment stretched, pressing against Clara's carefully maintained composure. She felt the weight of years, of practiced detachment and guarded self-control, settle upon her. The suggestion was not unexpected, yet hearing it aloud made it real in a way she could not easily dismiss. The air between them held a quiet patience, awaiting her answer. The group therapy circle shifted that day, with Clara Whitmore stepping into the role of participant rather than guide. Her seat felt different, the view altered by perspective. Samuel Greystone listened intently, his focus unwavering. Evelyn Hart offered gentle prompts, her questions opening small spaces for Clara to enter. They encouraged her to name what had long remained unnamed, their voices steady and without judgment. Clara felt both exposed and supported, the circle's presence forming a delicate balance between vulnerability and safety. The rhythm of the session was slower now, deliberate, allowing her words to find their way. Clara Whitmore spoke of the quiet hours when she reached for comfort in ways she could not fully justify. Her voice held both admission and restraint. Samuel Greystone's gray beard dipped in a nod, his expression steady. Evelyn Hart's indigo kimono folded softly as she leaned forward, her posture inviting more detail without pressing. Clara sensed their willingness to hear whatever she could share, the room's silence carrying a kind of permission. The act of speaking felt tentative, but necessary. Each word a small step toward dismantling the secrecy she had maintained. Naming her dependency felt both perilous and strangely liberating for Clara Whitmore. The words seemed to alter the air, giving shape to something that had long been amorphous. Samuel Greystone observed that truth often arrives with a mixture of relief and dread, his tone reflective. Evelyn Hart whispered that dread can dissolve under shared light, the phrase gentle yet certain. Clara considered this, sensing the possibility in their words. The moment held stillness, as though the room itself acknowledged the significance of what had been spoken. She felt both lighter and more aware of the path still ahead. Clara felt a shift in the room, subtle yet unmistakable, as if an unseen lock had been turned. The change was not in sound, but in presence. Samuel Greystone's gaze was warm now, his earlier searching replaced by quiet assurance. Evelyn Hart's presence remained steady, her calm forming a bridge over the chasm Clara had revealed. The three of them sat together in a silence that was no longer heavy, but instead held the promise of shared movement forward. Clara drew a slow breath, sensing that the boundary between them had been altered for good. Days later, Clara noticed her cravings receding slightly, replaced by a curiosity about the paths others had walked. The shift was small but real. Samuel Greystone shared a recent victory from one of his patients, the story carrying hope. Evelyn Hart spoke of resilience found in mutual disclosure, her words underscoring the value of shared experience. Clara listened, recognizing herself in their accounts. The exchange felt less like professional discourse and more like a collective weaving of survival and strength. She realized that her own journey was now part of this tapestry. The therapy sessions began to take on a new texture, with Clara blending professional guidance and personal vulnerability. The balance felt natural, though it had once seemed impossible. Samuel Greystone remarked that her honesty enriched the work, his voice carrying quiet respect. Evelyn Hart noted that the group's trust had deepened immeasurably, the change visible in the way participants spoke. Clara felt the truth of their observations, sensing a sturdier foundation beneath their collective efforts. What had begun as guarded exchanges now moved with greater openness, each session building on the shared courage of the last. On the final autumn evening of the season, Clara Whitmore stood by the tall window, her burgundy shawl catching the last amber light. The day's fading glow painted the room in soft gold. Samuel Greystone and Evelyn Hart sat nearby, their presence steady and familiar. No words were needed. The quiet between them held its own meaning. They were bound now by an unspoken pact to continue walking this shared road toward healing, whatever its turns might bring. Clara watched the light slip away, feeling both the weight and the promise of the journey ahead, the season closing yet leaving the path open.